Hello, everybody. We're live. We're here with the book club chat. Kyla, our new fearless leader. Introduce yourself, Kyla.
My name's Kyla Perlman, and I live in Colorado. I have a background in public health, and now I work with volunteers and interns for the local public health department. Um, I do that part time, and then I'm also raising three small boys that are 5, 3, and 3. So I like to talk to Sarah about raising boys too.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is the boys. This is the boys club. Okay, right now. I'm adding the Google Hangout link for anybody who wants to join us live, but this will also be broadcast for anybody who wants to watch later. So we are here and we are talking about Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. And anybody who's just joining who hasn't read the book, it is a story of, it's a nonfiction book. It's about 8 families in Milwaukee. And he kind of tells the story of what it's like to live in extreme poverty, issues of affordable housing through the eyes of these 8 families. And it won last year's Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction and a lot of other awards. So that's the book we're talking about.
Yeah, I actually read this one in January and I loved it so much. I think I've bought like 3 or 4 copies and given them away to friends and family.
I thought it was so brilliant. I definitely understand why it won the Pulitzer. So, and he's written a bunch of other stuff. He wrote a really, just for anybody who like is interested in this issue, but is like, I ain't got time to read the whole book. He wrote a brilliant New York Times article recently about the mortgage interest tax deduction, and how it's basically a social safety net for the middle class and punishes people. And at the end, I was like, burn it down. Let's get rid of it. He's very convincing, I think.
Yeah.
But this book in particular, he talks about 4 families and he kind of uses their processes. The most interesting choice I think he made is he chooses a landlord to follow as well, who is an African American woman who came from this neighborhood.
Yes.
So not easily villainized, which I thought was a fascinating choice.
Mm-hmm.
What did you
Yeah,
think about the landlord? Because that's, he kind of starts off with her.
he does. He does. And then he goes back to her several times. And there's another landlord that he's also talks with.
Oh yeah, the trailer park
The
landlord.
trailer park landlord. But I feel like you get the Sharina is the landlord name. I think you get a lot more of her perspective. And it was interesting because she's not an old white guy. You know, she doesn't come from a lot of money. She really made something of herself and was able to make this choice and is proud of herself as a business owner. And I thought it was really important to show any landlord's perspective on this because it is really easy to villainize landlords just across the board and just think that they're all, money grubbing, taking advantage of people. But there's a lot more to it in what they are dealing with. And I thought in particular, there's sort of this vicious cycle between the tenants being like, well, I'm not going to pay my rent if you're not going to fix the plumbing. And she's like, why should I fix the plumbing when you're just going to leave anyway, or you're going to, trash it. That was really interesting.
Well, and I thought one of the most interesting parts of that aspect with her was, I don't understand the business model. Like, I don't understand the eviction business model either. And so to learn about how her business works, how she makes money, like how she buys the property, dealing with fixing them up, like who's paying the bills, like hooking up with certain nonprofits and federal agencies that funnel people into these, and they're the ones paying the rent, like all that. Like I just straight up didn't understand how people make money doing this. And so I thought that was interesting as well. One of my favorite parts that he kind of starts off with the book too is this idea that like being a landlord generally was not a thing. Like it just like making money this way historically was not a common practice. I love that part where he talks about like the Library of Congress lists like 3 books about being a landlord in 1970, and by now there's like 300 plus. Like it just owning properties and being a landlord like this was not a business model and was not a thing like private citizens did to make money. It just wasn't.
It was more like I happen to have an extra
Yep.
space in my family's, property and we'll rent it out. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I thought that part was, I just didn't know that. I guess I've always kind of lived in this world where people were landlords. And so I didn't know that it's a rare thing. And he talks a lot about like how there used to be tenants unions and tenants rights, and you would never evict some. Like eviction was just, it was a really dramatic choice that was not something so many people used to face.
I thought the historical perspective was really interesting in all of that, and including the idea that neighborhoods used to band together against evictions and would, they'd have a renter strike, or they would riot, or they would, just prevent evictions from happening. And that there was this real community feel about it. And there was, it was sort of not officially unionized anyway, but kind of that idea that we're all connected because of our economic circumstance or where we're living. And so let's bond together.
Yep. Yeah. I thought that was really, really, really interesting. So the next thing I think the other big realization for me, because let me just, I was a renter for my husband and I rented the first, I guess, 3 years of our marriage. So not a long amount of time. I'd never had trouble affording rent. I never had any like we had some interactions that we were not thrilled with. I remember we had a landlord in DC who charged us for coat hangers, which like took coat hangers out of our deposit, and we're like, that's cool, whatever. And so it's just a whole world that I did not know anything about. And I thought what was so eye-opening to me is, again, like from the landlord side, I didn't understand how people made money. And from the rental side, there were so many things I didn't understand, mainly that, you would think living in a less well-off area of town, the rents would be lower, right. And they're not. They're just as high. You're talking about, statistically they say like your rent should be, or like financially, to be financially sound, like your rent needs to be like 30% of your income. And you're talking about areas where they're not nice, not safe neighborhoods and not nice places to live. And they're like 70% of people's monthly income. The rent is really high.
Well, and he talked about how there's like a standard, I guess when you're getting vouchers from the government, or when the government is paying in some way for your housing, there's like a standard that they'll pay regardless of which part of the city, because they would average rents across the city.
Which seems crazy.
That was another way that the landlord was really making bank, because she was able to charge whatever the government allowed her to charge, even though if it was someone who wasn't coming with assistance, she would charge them less.
Right.
If they were paying straight cash.
And that's
so really how she was working the system, and she liked working the system, but also working with people who had, in her, it was more of a guaranteed income source. So she felt like they were going to make the rent more regularly if they were getting a welfare check, if they were on Social Security, if they were on disability, that kind of thing.
Well, and I just think, the rents are high. I think a lot of it taxpayer expense. And the impact on the people in these properties is awful. Like you cannot even begin to pull yourself out of poverty if you're paying 70% of your monthly income for an apartment. And you couldn't, I don't think you could do that if every single thing went right. Mm-hmm. I'm talking, you lived on ramen every day. You didn't spend a cent of income outside of the ramen. You never got sick. It wouldn't matter. Like you didn't get sick. You didn't have addiction. You didn't lose a job. Your car didn't break. Like even if none of that happened, 70% of your money, you still couldn't do it. You still couldn't do it. Right. You couldn't pay heat. You couldn't pay electricity. Like it's just
there were so many other expenses too. Like every time someone had to move, there was additional expenses in the move.
Oh, I thought the part about the storing their stuff and how expensive it was to store their stuff. They don't get a choice.
Yeah.
Sucks.
Yeah. So you have to pay for someone to keep your stuff, and you can't get it. And you can't save any money because you're paying for someone to keep your stuff. Yeah. No, it's just the system is so rigged again.
Well, and that's what you realize too in the book, is watching these people's story, how it's a domino. And so one eviction leads to another eviction, leads to a job loss, leads to another eviction, leads to a a court fine not paid. Then all of a sudden you've been arrested on the outstanding warrant. Then you can't afford bail. Then you really can't pay your rent. Then we just punish and punish and punish the poor and then expect that somehow in this tsunami of consequences, they're supposed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Right.
It's just crazy to me. So what particular family's or person's story in there were you really struck by?
I think I was thinking a lot about Arlene and her two boys. And I think that's the one where there's like an image of her and her boys standing outside. They've been evicted and it's like in the snow and they don't have anywhere to go and just their stuff is on the curb.
It was like Christmas too, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was around Christmas time. Yeah. And it was just, and thinking about the people the sheriff's department and the movers who do this job and like go in and put people's stuff on the curb in the snow with two kids. Like, I don't know how you do that. that one really struck me. And I think her and then there's a couple others that had kids involved and thinking about how it's okay for landlords to say, I'm not going to rent to you because you have children. And that just struck me because I guess that's not a protected class or they're just getting around it some way to say, if you have kids, you can't rent here because landlords don't want to deal with kids. So
I think they're like a pet or something.
Yeah, because they're going to cause more damage and they're going to be noisy and I don't know what all. But that really struck me that people were hiding their kids or pretending they didn't have kids or they had fewer kids than they would say they had fewer kids than they really did in order to rent a place. Which just seems like if we're going to protect any class of people, let's protect kids and keep them in homes. I think also thinking about the instability, all of the things that you were talking about, like being able to overcome poverty and keep a steady job and not fall back into drug addiction or whatever. But children like having to move different schools every, few months or not feeling safe and secure in their home and it's cold or they don't have the running water doesn't work, all of these things and how that would affect children as they're growing up, both their mental health, their education, their ability to get out of poverty as adults. It just seems almost impossible to do. And so I hadn't really thought that much about, I've always had safe, stable housing. That's never been something I've had to worry about. And now, again, having little kids, I do think about a lot of things through their eyes because my goal, right, is to make them feel as safe and secure and provide them as stable of an environment as possible. And I have all the resources that I need to do that. And yet I'm still constantly thinking about that. And if I didn't have those resources, I just don't know that just must be really, really hard for parents and for kids that are going through this system, never really knowing where they're going to sleep and going through the homeless shelter and all of that.
Well, and I think he did such a good job, even with her, of sort of portraying the complexity of these people in that, it was a woman with two boys sitting in the snow. Like every choice she made wasn't great.
Mm-hmm.
And she had other children that had been taken from her.
Mm-hmm.
And like all this stuff, like I just think that he did such a good job of being honest and vulnerable about the complexity of humanity, and that doesn't change when you're in poverty. And I think in doing that, he does a really good job of being like, okay, this is the reality of the situation. This is honestly, like, some of the people in the book are addicts. Some of the people in the book, like I said, like, don't make awesome choices. But I think he just presents it fairly and is like, but is this still what we think the fair outcome is? If we don't agree with all their choices, if we think that, if they're an addict or if they wouldn't have made the financial choice, like, is this what we think the consequences should be?
Right. Yeah. I loved how he didn't really whitewash anything. He was very honest about, and at the very end of the book, it talks about how he did this research where he actually lived in these neighborhoods for, several months at a time and really followed people around. And so I think that's fascinating, just thinking about doing that. But he's not saying these people are angels and these people are devils. There's nothing. Let's say he's nuanced.
Yeah. Well, like that's one of my favorite moments in the book is the lady in the trailer park who she lives with her brother and then she gets evicted and like her daughters, I think she was married and she had some daughters. Her daughters don't, one of her daughters doesn't speak to her because they don't like the choices she's made and they're really frustrated with her and all these things. And she has this moment where she like gets her, like knowing she's going to have this bill to pay and her stuff's in storage. She goes to the grocery store with her food stamps and buys like lobster.
Yeah.
And makes herself this lobster dinner. And just the way he talks about it and like sort of talks to her and shares what she says about the lobster dinner. And it's just, I loved it so much. And I was like, you know what, lady? Eat your lobster. Yeah. No judgment. You go find your lobster. And not in a like, I just think I think he just does a good job of being like, people are human beings.
Yeah. And I think I was reading a little bit last night about I forgot the guy's name. He was a nurse and he had
addiction,
an injury, and he got addiction. So he went to get help from the county for his addiction, and they only take like 3 or 4 people every day, and there were already 15 people in line ahead of him before he got there at like 7:00. And instead of come back the next day, he just went on a bender, and he was like, whatever, because he's like, drugs. I like drugs. They're a mini vacation, and I can see being in that.
Needing a vacation from that life.
Situation. Yeah, desperate of a situation and not being able to see a way out of it, even if, as you said, they save every penny for years. That was kind of going back to a little bit, but the being able to access affordable housing is so difficult too. So, you might be on a list for years and years and years. Anyway, even if you try to do everything right, it's just stacked against you. So you might as well have some lobster.
Yep. Or some heroin. I think that and now especially, I mean, you just got to think about every moment in your life where you've tried to do something or to not do something you really want to do. Even on the smallest scale, like we've all, like, nobody's eating healthy all the time. And just like the amount of willpower that takes for those small things. Can you imagine being a heroin addict, getting yourself to the place that early in the morning, like being like, okay, because he's basically trying to treat his own disease through willpower. He gets there and they don't have room for him.
Yeah, they can't help him.
I mean, just the being able to like sit in a room and admit that you need help is such a huge thing for somebody struggling with addiction, to be able to get to the space to check yourself in, and then they can't take you. And it's really interesting because a couple people's stories do have, not happy endings, but massive improvements. And so often it was one, he was able to actually gain access to some affordable, like government subsidized housing, and another family just moved. They just left Milwaukee. They went down to like Brownsville, Tennessee or something, and were able to live in a place with more affordable housing, which opened up all manner of options for them.
Mm-hmm. That was an interesting piece too. Like, when people were able to call on family for help, or whether they were willing to call on family for help, and how many of these folks didn't have like that backup system in place, or they had used that backup system in the past and it wasn't available anymore. Because I think that's often, I think even Sharina, the landlord, said, just sort of assumed that Arlene had family somewhere that she could stay with that would help her out. And she didn't.
Yeah.
It's about just sort of the social, the way poverty has been for the last, 60, 70 years, and the justice system that needs to be reformed, and drug epidemics, and how that's broken down all of those support systems that families used to have that could help out in these situations.
Well, and I think, so much of it, in the way you respond, the way you dealt with it is affected by who you are, where you live, and what your, situation is. Like, I think another really interesting part of the book is how he talks about how women navigate eviction and how men do. And like the woman in the trailer park, like there was another man that was getting evicted, and they'll get up in the guy's face and advocate for themselves and say, well, I'll do this repair because I can't pay this bill right now. I'll fix something up and I'll pay for my rent that way. whereas women are much less comfortable doing that, don't often advocate for themselves strongly, and so get even further screwed by the process.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really, really interesting and nothing I'd really even ever thought about before.
No, but it makes a lot of sense. Women, there was the part about how you can't really call for help in a domestic violence situation.
Oh, right. That was crazy because you'll get evicted.
I just can't believe that is allowed on any level. But basically, if I guess a lot of cities have these sort of nuisance laws that if the police are called to your property a certain number of times and in a certain period of time, then you're asked to evict the tenant. And so a nuisance call is a domestic violence call. And I just can't believe that A, considered a nuisance call, and B, that could get you evicted. So, women aren't calling when they need to.
Well, and I think it's really difficult when I think, again, what the brilliance of this book is, it's very difficult to talk about eviction with people who have not struggled in poverty. In the same way, like on the podcast today, we were talking about voter ID laws. And as somebody who's like never struggled with the government or is not in a historically discriminated class of people, they're like, what's a big deal? Bring your ID. And with evictions, it's like, what's the big deal? Pay your bills on time. If you don't pay your bill, I mean, it's really hard to have a conversation with somebody when they're like, but they didn't pay their rent. Right. You're like, yeah, I get it. I get it. But it's not as simple as the transaction between the landlord and the tenant. There's way more going on right here. And I think that's what he's kind of pulling back the curtain and saying, yeah, they might not have paid their bill. They may not have paid their rent. Let's talk about why they're not paying their rent.
Right.
Because the cultural narrative is it's a character flaw because you didn't pay your rent. And I think there's just so much more to it. And then you just, it compounds. It compounds one eviction, and then you get screened and you can't get any more places because you've been evicted. And then or you're living in places where they're not screening properly for things. And so you're exposed to more crime and you're exposed to more risk. And then you maybe leave because you don't think that it's just the compounding of it all is, I think, what makes the book so brutal.
I thought it was interesting just the what happens when the government does get involved. So like the trailer park, for example, there had been so many complaints or so many issues with the trailer park that they were going to shut it down completely. The city council was going to shut it down completely if they didn't bring in a new management company to deal with it. And so in that situation, and then like there were situations where there's a hole in the wall or the window's broken and the landlord's not fixing it. But if the tenant calls the building inspector, then that they may have to condemn the building, and then the tenant doesn't have a place to live, or landlord will find an excuse to evict that person because they involved, an inspector. And then there was the one about one of the social workers was talking with the landlord and sort of leaked that the tenant was looking for something else. So then the landlord decided to go ahead and evict her. Well, and just how all of these things, like particularly inspections, I used to be a regulator of restaurants. And so it's all there for good purpose, right? To protect people, to make sure that they're living in a building that is safe,
right,
and not infested, or is going to be warm in the winter, or isn't going to be dangerous for children. And yet bringing those inspectors in will sometimes cause even more problems in this situation.
I was looking at my notes from my Kindle of reading in the box, and I think in particular at the end he has some really good recommendations about how to at least remove some of these compounding problems. Obviously, the domestic violence, so that you can't be evicted, protecting that class of people if you call and report your abuser. I think one of the like I said at the beginning, one of the most interesting things that he really talks about and advocates for is removing, or at least putting some limits on the mortgage interest tax deduction, because that would free up so much more additional money for affordable housing support. And you could expand the voucher program, which would be awesome. Although we clearly need to talk about the formula for how we set the rent. But he talks about a lot of things. He talks about payday loans. He talks about some of the criminal justice reforms that could help people. So I do appreciate that the book was not just, here's my dog Cookie. Everybody say hi, Cookie. Not just, it's all terrible. He does seem to have some really well thought of, well researched policy recommendations.
And he does, if you go to the website for Evicted, they have a link to how you can help.
Oh, cool.
I think it's called justshelter.org, and it lists, you can either say I want to get involved locally or I want to get involved nationally. I didn't look at nationally, but locally I could like click on Colorado and it would show all the different organizations in the state who are working on different aspects, including things like legal aid, which I thought we haven't talked about that part yet, but like actual what eviction court is like. And, landlords are almost always represented by counsel, and tenants almost never are if they even show up at all. But anyway, providing legal aid. So anyway, there's an organization in my town that I'm somewhat familiar with who works on this issue, in addition to like a homeless shelter. But so there are, I think that was another thing reading this book is like, this is awful. What can we do? What can I do? And so there are some resources out there.
I'm going to do that after we get off here. I didn't realize that's a really cool thing that you can join us with. So I'm definitely going to do that. All right. Do we have anything else we want to talk about Evicted, or do we want to talk about what we're going to read next?
I think we talked about most everything on my list.
Yay. So we decided, first I have to share a very funny exchange where I was like, Kyla, you want to read Fear, Bob Woodward's book next? And she was like, no, I don't. No, not up for it.
That sounds like torture.
Beth and I are reading that. We're going to share our thoughts. But I just thought, she was like, I said something uplifting. I don't want to read that. So we decided to read Brene Brown's new book, Daring to Lead. I'm very excited about this.
I've already heard great things about it. So.
Yeah, because she's the queen of all things, and she's amazing, and we're really excited.
Well, it'll be my first Brene Brown book.
Oh, my gosh. Well,
I know.
I told you don't have to read it first, but you should go read the other. I mean, you should read them. I don't think you have to read them in order, but you definitely should read them.
Well, I've heard great things. Maybe this will be my gateway, and then I'll want to go back and read all the rest.
Because it's like The Gift of Imperfection is really about like internal dialogue about being a perfectionist. And then, let's see. What's next? Daring Greatly. That's the one that made her famous.
That was last year, right?
No, it's Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, Braving the Wilderness.
Okay.
Is it Daring Greatly? No, wait. Isn't that?
I thought so because, well, I don't know because I haven't read them, but Daring to Lead sounded really familiar to me. So I was like, I think, or Dare to Lead. I thought
Dare to Lead.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hold on. Let's look on. Daring Greatly. Yeah. Oh, The Power of Vulnerability too. I think that's like a shorter.
There's a lot of books.
No, I don't think Power of Vulnerability is a full book or something. Because it's The Gifts of Information, Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, Braving the Wilderness, and now we have Daring to Lead. It's like a work-focused one, I think.
Yeah.
It'll be good. I'm not worried about it. So that's what we're going to read next, everybody. Get excited.
Yeah, and we'll try to give you a more heads up before we actually have our discussion.
Yeah, we'll do it at night so people can join in.
Okay, that sounds great.
Well, thanks. Everybody can watch this on the rebroadcast. So thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for being a part of the Pantsuit Politics Book Club. We'll just keep chugging along here. And thanks for Kyla for stepping up when our founder went to law school and has much more important things to read than our books.
Thanks. I'm trying.
We love it. We're happy to have you.
All right.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.